The official baseball rules. The Bible of baseball, if you will. It's something that I've actually never read, which at face value sounds like a stupid thing considering I run a platform that produces content entirely based on this sport. But I hope I'm not alone in this. For me personally, I learned the rules of this sport from family members, friends, coaches, and just watching games through my entire life. I also don't think I know a single person who's read the entire rulebook either. And it's totally possible I'm being ignorant here and you all have a hardcover copy sitting on your nightstand. If that's the case, then I apologize, but I presume this is the same situation for most of you. You likely learned this sport through the people around you and through experience, and therefore had no need to read up on MLB's extensive rules front to back, especially because you were likely a kid learning these rules. I know I wasn't going to read 150 pages of pure rules at 5 years old, and that makes perfect sense to me because that's exactly how it was for me. Let me tell you, if I make this entire video and I learn that most people have read the full rulebook front to back, I'm gonna feel really stupid. Regardless, I've admitted I haven't read it, and the one thing I have always been curious about is that there just has to be the most random stuff in here. I'm talking about rules that make absolutely no sense or never occur. Like, there has to be information in this rulebook that 90% of fans never witnessed in a game before. So to satisfy my own curiosity, and hopefully yours too, I'm going to read the entire rulebook created for Major League Baseball up to date to 2024 and tell you the funny parts. There's a possibility I come out of this with absolutely nothing and this video never sees the light of day, but hopefully there's some interesting stuff in here for me to talk about. To better describe what my goal here is, I want to find rules that are either really rare to see in a game and therefore people might not know about them, or rules that are just not enforced whatsoever. And if it's the latter, should those rules just be removed entirely? I also want to bring up rules that catch my eye even if I knew about them already, because there are ones that people frequently misunderstand, and I think it would be fun to clarify them directly from the source. And lastly, I'll just point out anything I find funny or interesting. If you came into this video expecting a beginner's lesson on MLB rules, this is not that. I'm sorry if that's what you were looking for. This is a lot more dumb. Alright, now it's time for me to read the entire MLB rulebook for the first time. Don't get me wrong, reading this rulebook is not a daunting task or something. It's 156 pages long. That's like half of the first Harry Potter book. But it still takes time to read. And what makes this really unfun for me is I'm going to be reading page after page after page of rules that I already know. I'll be reading stuff like, a run is when a player touches first, second, third, and home in succession before 3 outs are made. Seeing things that are second nature to you explain like you know nothing about them is pretty irritating, and most of the rules are going to be that. All in all, I'm not going to act like this is some insane challenge. I'm just a horrible reader, and this took me longer to read than I'm willing to admit. Alright, now let's begin with my first criticism, the title page. Now, we're actually starting on page 2, also known as the section that describes how the field is laid out. First of all, the rules are really showing their age here, because they're referring to home plate as home base has already bothered me. What I really want to take note of here, though, is this section that reads, "It is desirable that the line from home base through the pitcher's plate to second base shall run east-northeast," also referred to as east by northeast, but I'm just going to say it how the rulebook writes it. Now, for all of you who haven't brushed up on your cardinal directions, I've got you. East-northeast is a secondary intercardinal direction. So on a compass, we've got north, south, east, and west as our main cardinal directions, and the intercardinal directions are the ones in between, like how northeast and southeast are in between north and east and south and east. Well, secondary intercardinal directions are the ones in between all those. So east-northeast is in between east and northeast. So why is this important at all? Well, it's because we're 2 pages in, and here I am on Google Earth to check how many MLB teams actually followed this suggestion. Keep in mind that it's not a rule. It's just a recommendation based on the sun's position throughout the day. They naturally don't want to play a game where the sun can be directly in the batter's eyes, of course. So I wasn't kidding. I went to every MLB team stadium on Google Earth, and here are the results I found. I probably could have just looked this up, but what's the fun in that? The largest result I got was 9 teams pointing northeast, which is close, but not quite exactly what the rulebook said to do. Those teams are the Orioles, Red Sox, Cubs, Royals, Angels, A's, Mariners, Rangers, and Rays. Before I get into the similarities between these teams, I just have to point out how funny it is that Tropicana Field is pointing generally in the suggested direction, despite being the only stadium that cannot open. Anyways, beyond the fact that this is easily the most popular direction, what makes these teams similar to each other is when their stadiums were built. We have some of the oldest stadiums in Major League Baseball here, with Fenway and Wrigley being the oldest, as well as Angel Stadium, the Coliseum, and Kauffman Stadium being pretty old as well. And although Camden Yards, T-Mobile Park, and Tropicana Field were built in the 90s, that's actually on the older side of MLB stadiums. 16 MLB teams have stadiums that were built in the 2000s. Overall, the older stadiums being the ones that tried to comply with this rulebook suggestion makes a ton of sense actually. As time went on, teams likely cared less about this. By the way, I'm not so deep into absurdity that I'm going to focus on the cardinal direction of all these stadiums, but don't forget that these parks are northeast, not east-northeast, of which we only have 2 MLB stadiums out of 30 that are running home through the pitcher's mound in that direction. Those 2 stadiums are Busch Stadium, home to the St. Louis Cardinals, and Yankee Stadium, home to the New York Yankees. So congratulations to the 2 most successful franchises in Major League Baseball. You also won the Cardinal Direction Championship. I'm not saying World Series championships are synonymous with Cardinal Directions, but I'm just throwing it out there. Okay, I'm glad we got the dumbest thing out of the way early, so the rest of this video will hopefully not focus on one rule for that long. Especially considering it wasn't even an actual rule, but I can't guarantee anything. Another really funny rule to point out is that the minimum distance requirement from home plate to the nearest fence, aka the closest distance for a home run, is just 250 feet. MLB clearly realized that was a bad idea, so they added a new rule that requires all stadiums built after June 1st, 1958 to have a minimum distance of 325 feet down the foul lines. Of course, you might be asking, well, what about a park like Fenway? It has existed well before 1958. Old stadiums got grandfathered in, so they don't have to reconstruct an entire ballpark just to comply with a new rule. That, plus I also think MLB knows not to mess with something as historic as Fenway Park. The last time there was a chance to get rid of Fenway was in the early 2000s, and that never happened, so at this point, Fenway's here to stay probably forever. Fenway's dimensions are weird, and they are less than that 325 feet mark to the poles, but they're not egregious or anything, so it works. Pesky Pole and the Monster may be a short distance, but they compromise with a deep right field and a huge wall in left field. Wrigley is the only other ballpark in the entire league that's built before 1958, and its dimensions are not too crazy. But you might ask yourself again, well, what about a ballpark like Minute Maid? The Crawford boxes in left field are 315 feet down the line. Or what about Yankee Stadium? Not only is the infamous short porch in right just 314 feet, left field is also 318 feet. So what's the deal here? When I saw this, I figured that it's not a set in stone rule. You have to do a little convincing with the league front office to get special dimensions for your stadium. I tried to look online for a record of all the stadiums that went around this rule and why, but I kinda had trouble finding results. Eventually, the one source I found was from a 2012 blog called Close Call Sports. This guy, Jeremy Dirks, made a blog post about the minimum dimensions rule, and the results are exactly what I thought they'd be. Yankee Stadium was approved because the old Yankee Stadium, which existed well before 1958, had the same exact dimensions: 318 to left, 408 to center, and 314 to right. Although this blog post points out that the Yankees actually lowered the walls by a few feet and still got approved by the commissioner at the time. But see, look, the Astros made a different kind of deal. In exchange for making left field a shorter distance, they made the walls 19 feet tall. Other examples are Camden Yards, which had a building in the way, and PNC Park, which had the Allegheny River in the way, making it impossible to reach that 325 minimum. It seems that teams took the same route as Boston, making unique park dimensions by compromising with the height of the walls. So the teams made some binding vows, and that's how they got around this rule. Now that we're done extensively talking about stadium orientation and dimensions, we can go a little more rapid fire on some of these rules. Here on page 5, we have Rule 301, which states, no player shall intentionally discolor or damage the ball by rubbing it with soil, rosin, paraffin, licorice, sandpaper, emery paper, or other foreign substances. This is a typical foreign substance rule. I just think it's funny that stuff like licorice and sandpaper are here because it probably happened before, and that's why they felt the need to write it down specifically. Here's an interesting rule I found on page 11. Rule 401E's comment, which states, after a home run is hit out of the playing grounds, the umpire shall not deliver a new ball to the pitcher or catcher until the batter hitting the home run has crossed the plate. This is definitely not enforced. Even the first home run I found by just searching for MLB highlights the day I read this showed a situation where this rule was not followed. The umpire is clearly delivering the ball before the runner touches home. Does this matter at all? Not really. I guess I understand why it's here. It's telling umps not to put a ball quote-unquote in play before the play is actually over, but let's be real here. This would never be enforced. I thought this next one was kind of weird. We have Rule 404, which is about weather and field conditions. Now, I already knew it was up to the home team to decide whether a game would be started based on weather conditions, which usually ends up being rain, but in case you didn't know, that's who decides on a game being played during inclement weather, the home team. That's not what I'm highlighting though. What I find interesting is that Rule 401B states that for double headers, Game 1 is decided by the home team still, but Game 2 is decided by the crew chief of the umpires. Why? I genuinely don't understand the purpose of that distinction. I'm curious if anyone knows why or has an idea as to why, because it's clearly significant as it's in the rulebook. My only guess is when they made this decades ago, they figured that after a game has been played, the umpire would have the best jurisdiction on field conditions for another game on the same field. Other than that, I don't really know. It's one of those rules I didn't know about and just find it intriguing. Next, we have probably the most violated rule in baseball, Rule 406, No Fraternization. Players in uniform shall not address or mingle with spectators, nor sit in the stands before, during, or after a game. No manager, coach, or player shall address any spectators before or during a game. Players of opposing teams shall not fraternize at any time while in uniform. Every part of this rule is not followed. Players talk with fans all the time. They talk with opposing players all the time. And the same goes for managers and coaches. Seeing a player in the stands is rare, but it definitely happens. I guess I can understand why someone would have made this rule a century ago to, quote, keep the competitive integrity, but it's just a useless rule that will never be enforced. This rule gets violated in every single professional baseball game, and nobody really cares. If there was a rule I'm most confident can be removed, it's this one. I honestly don't even really understand how it's still here in 2024. This next rule is one you've probably never seen happen, and it comes in right after the last one. Rule 407 is all about security, and it generally talks about how only authorized individuals should be on the field during playing time. You know, like players, coaches, managers, umpires, etc. And that the home team needs to provide the necessary protection to prevent people from going on the field and subsequently disrupting the game. All that stuff is completely normal. What makes things interesting is the penalty. It states, if the field is not cleared in a reasonable length of time, which shall in no case be less than 15 minutes after the visiting team's refusal to play, the umpire-in-chief may forfeit the game to the visiting team. This rule would never occur for like an individual fan disruption. It's usually for situations where an entire crowd cannot be contained in a reasonable amount of time. Which leads me to another part of the rule. How do forfeited games work? This is a rule mentioned much later, but I feel like now is the perfect time to talk about it. Once a game is forfeited, the final score will officially be 9-0. I believe the reason for the 9 runs specifically is to have 1 run for each inning. However, at the same time, all stats from both teams and players up until the point where the game was forfeited are counted as official statistics. So it's technically a 9-0 game, but the real stats are recorded at the same time. It's a pretty complicated situation, and you likely won't see this happen. The last MLB forfeit was in 1995, and it was a bizarre situation. It would take an entire section or even video to explain it properly, but the quick explanation is that fans were given souvenir balls upon entry into this game, and by the end of the game, they were upset by some stuff, and everyone was throwing their souvenir on the field. Anyways, if your team is losing, and you're also attending one of their away games, consider the fact that if you manage to disrupt the game for long enough, your team wins. For obvious reasons, I'm kidding. Don't actually do this. Don't be an idiot. If we jump forward to page 20, Rule 503C is about the first and third base coaches and how they must stay within their designated coaches boxes. Now, similar to the No Fraternization rule, I already knew about this one, and once again, it's a rule that's not really enforced at all. The base coaches are rarely standing within the outlined coaches boxes. If you didn't know this and were wondering why there are these little cutouts on each side of the field that nobody stands in, these are supposed to be the coaches boxes. I'm sure it gets enforced every now and then when a manager gets petty and points it out to an umpire, but 99% of the time, it doesn't matter at all. This rule can basically be removed. Moving down to Rule 505A5, this is one that I found really odd. The rule states, the batter becomes a runner when a fair ball passes over a fence or into the stands at a distance from home base of 250 feet or more. Such hit entitles the batter to a home run when he shall have touched all bases legally. That's just describing a home run, albeit in a weird way, but still pretty simple. We learned earlier that field dimensions originally required the outfield walls to be a minimum of 250 feet, so although this is outdated and worded weirdly, it's still correct to this day. I just find it a little redundant because the rules already imply that if a ball goes over the fence, those fences have to be 250 feet, but I understand the rules wanting to be as specific as possible. However, it starts to get more weird during the second part of the rule. A fair fly ball that passes out of the playing field at a point less than 250 feet from home base shall entitle the batter to advance to second base only. How is that even going to happen? Even before they changed the field dimensions rule in 1958, we just talked about how the walls had to be a minimum of 250 feet. So how in the world is a fly ball going over the wall at less than 250 feet? If you're reading this and thinking, oh, it's talking about ground rule doubles, right? No, ground rule doubles are described by the very next rule. So this is completely separate. It's specifically talking about fly balls, not ones that hit the ground and bounce into the stands. There are some rules in this whole thing that exist solely based on the very, very low to impossible chance that something occurs, and I totally get that, but this is actually not even possible. Unless I'm totally misunderstanding it, but I don't think I am. The only conclusion I have is when these rules were being made a long time ago, this rule existed before the field dimensions rule that require the fences to be a minimum of 250 feet. That's the only thing I can think of. Either way though, this rule no longer serves a purpose in today's game, so it can easily be removed. Here's a quick one on page 32. If a batter strikes out and the ball gets stuck in the umpire's mask or any other part of his equipment, the batter gets to go to first base. Normally in baseball, if a batter strikes out and it isn't caught by the catcher, the hitter then has the ability to try to get on base before they throw him out. But in this situation, if the ball isn't caught and gets stuck on the umpire, the hitter is then automatically entitled to first. It's another one of those rules where the odds of it happening are so low, but if it does, either the umpires are going to get it wrong because they weren't expecting it to ever happen, or they get it right and everyone is wondering who came up with this rule, giving the batter the benefit of the doubt in this situation. Personally, if I were making the rule, I feel like it would be fairer to make it a dead ball and an automatic out. Or it's an out and all base runners except the batter advance one base. The pitcher still bested the batter, but I don't know. It's just a funny rule. This next rule is one I had absolutely no idea about, and that might be on me, but I'm curious if other people were unaware of this one too. First, I need to preface what I thought this rule was. When a runner is struck by a batted ball that their teammate hit and wasn't misdirected by any fielder, they are out if they got hit in fair territory. That's what I thought it was, but the real rule is a little different. Rule 506C6 says, if a fair ball goes through or by an infielder, no other infielder has a chance to make a play on the ball, and the ball touches a runner immediately behind the infielder that the ball went through or by, the ball is in play and the umpire shall not declare the runner out. I had no idea that a base runner getting hit by a batted ball was dependent on whether or not a fielder blew their chance at fielding said ball. I always thought that in general, if the runner got hit by the ball in fair territory, he was automatically out. But that's actually not the case, and now I've learned a pretty important distinction of this rule. I would say that this is the first really significant thing I've learned so far. A lot of the other stuff were random things or things that will never happen or me highlighting something I knew already, but this can easily occur in a game. I'm sure many of you knew about this already and think I'm dumb for not knowing it, but I'm happily willing to admit I learned something new here. Now we're back to a rule I already knew about, but I want to talk about it because it's fun and not super common to see. On page 38, we get a long explanation of Rule 507F, which is entirely about ambidextrous pitchers, also known as switch pitchers. A switch hitter is quite common in baseball, but there have not been many switch pitchers, especially ones that switch arms constantly throughout a game. I know there are guys in minor league farm systems right now, most notably the college kid drafted by the Mariners in the first round this year, but so far in the 21st century, there's only been one switch pitcher in the big leagues, and that was one Pat Venditti. He's basically the only reason I know how any of these switch pitcher rules work, and I'm sure that's the same for many of you. He didn't pitch for that long and never really had a big role on any team, but he was a true switch pitcher. And because of guys in the minors, we'll likely be seeing another one sooner rather than later. In that case, I think we should talk about two really fascinating rules regarding switch pitchers, just to get everyone prepared. First of all, I'm sure some who have never seen a switch pitcher are curious. What happens when a switch pitcher faces off against a switch hitter? Who gets the advantage? That's a fun rule to talk about, and the quick answer is the batter. The long answer is that according to the rules, a pitcher must indicate visually to the umpire-in-chief, the batter, and any runners the hand with which he intends to pitch, which may be done by wearing his glove on the other hand while touching the pitcher's plate. The pitcher is not permitted to pitch with the other hand until the batter is retired, the batter becomes a runner, the inning ends, the batter is substituted for by a pinch hitter, or the pitcher incurs an injury. So a switch hitter is allowed to change sides anytime during an at-bat, and a switch pitcher must decide which side he's throwing with before the at-bat starts, which I think is a fair enough compromise. It's not like we can have the pitcher and hitter swapping sides back and forth until the end of time. Surely that would be a disaster. And that's exactly what it was, a disaster. Just like any good MLB rule, we had to experience a stupid situation first to figure out it needed to become one. So I mentioned earlier how Pat Venditti was a recent switch pitcher, but of course, there weren't many like him. And since there weren't many like him, there was a time in a minor league game when he came face to face with a switch hitter, and it was complicated. At the time, there actually wasn't a rule about switch pitchers needing to indicate which arm they'd be using before the at-bat. So Venditti essentially had the same privilege as a switch hitter. MLB obviously didn't think any of this through, because when he faced off against switch hitter Ralph Enriquez in the bottom of the 8th of a minor league game, it resulted in a standstill. It all started when Enriquez came to the plate as a righty, causing Venditti to decide that he'd pitch with his right hand. This leads to Enriquez asking the ump what they should do, and the ump has no idea because there's nothing about this in the rules. So Enriquez decides that since Venditti is going to pitch righty, he'll just hit lefty. This then leads to Venditti switching to his left arm and Enriquez going straight back into the righty batter's box once again. And that was the final straw, as everyone decided that despite how funny it was, they couldn't watch these two switch sides for an eternity, leading to the game being delayed as everyone tried to understand how MLB didn't realize this rule could happen. Thus, we were given the Venditti rule. Before we move on from ambidextrous pitchers, I did mention there were two parts of this rule that I found intriguing. If you paid close attention to the quote I mentioned earlier, you might have caught that a switch pitcher cannot alternate hands until the batter is retired, the batter becomes a runner, the inning ends, the batter is substituted for by a pinch hitter, or the pitcher incurs an injury. If we keep reading along, we can then see it says, in the event a pitcher switches pitching hands during an at-bat because he has suffered an injury, the pitcher may not, for the remainder of the game, pitch with the hand from which he has switched. I thought this was a really cool rule because there's really nothing like it in the whole sport. A situation where a pitcher gets hurt, but not hurt enough to leave the game because he can swap arms. It's incredibly unlikely, but it could happen. Now we'll move on from all that switch pitcher talk because we have another one that I just found funny. A batter is out when, after he has acquired legal possession of a base, he runs the bases in reverse order for the purpose of confusing the defense or making a travesty of the game. The umpire shall immediately call time and declare the runner out. This rule is fairly obvious, but I can't help but mention that it got a chuckle out of me when I saw the way they phrased it. Nobody makes a travesty of our beloved game on our watch by running the bases wrong. I just love that they assume that there are two possibilities for running the bases in reverse. Number one is to confuse the defense, of course, and number two is to spit in the face of the baseball gods. This might be my favorite rule in the whole thing, and it's the only time they word a rule like this. Using foreign substances? Nah. Interfering with a play? Nope. Arguing balls and strikes? Nope again. Running the bases in reverse? You're dead to me. Moving along, we're gonna observe what I like to call random stuff that is possible, so we had to make a rule about it. These kinds of rules are ones that you will probably never see in an MLB game, but because it's it's technically possible, it's gotta be in the rule book. This rule says, if the defensive team on its first appeal errs, a request for a second appeal on the same runner at the same base shall not be allowed by the umpire. Intended meaning of the word is that the defensive team in making an appeal threw the ball out of play. For example, if the pitcher threw to first base to appeal and threw the ball into the stands, no second appeal would be allowed. Alright, one rule later, and this is the new funniest thing in the rulebook. Part of me wonders when would this ever happen, but at the same time, we need to have this rule because what if it does actually happen? What if the pitcher just absolutely hurls a ball into the stands on an appeal play? What are we gonna do? Well, no need to worry, because MLB accounted for that. If you somehow throw the ball into the stands on an appeal, you just lost your chance, pal, and you made a travesty of our game. Alright, we are now a little bit past the halfway point because I just read 30 straight pages of rules that I found nothing interesting in, leaving us at page 83 of 156. So far, this has been exactly how I thought it would be. I'm reading rule after rule of stuff I already know, and every once in a while I go, huh, that's kind of funny, or that'd be cool to talk about, and jot it down. Anyways, let's continue. Here we have the comment for Rule 602D. In the case of rain or wet field, the umpire may instruct the pitcher to carry the rosin bag in his hip pocket. Maybe I just don't pay attention enough when I watch these games, but I have never seen this happen. I feel like every time it's pouring rain, the rosin bag just sits there suffering until it's replaced by a fresh one. I've never seen the umpire tell the pitcher to keep it in their pocket. Obviously, the rule implies this is an optional thing, so it's not like it's mandatory, but I'm curious if anyone has ever seen this happen, and maybe I'm just not paying attention enough. For our next rule, I really need to preface this by saying I read this one at 1 in the morning after already reading this rulebook for hours, and I actually thought I was losing my mind. Pages 85, 86, and 87 are entirely dedicated to Rule 603B, also known as batting out of turn. If you thought that batting out of turn meant a quick and easy penalty, you'd be sorely mistaken. There are 2 full pages here of different hypothetical scenarios of what needs to happen when someone bats out of turn. Why is that the case? Well, when someone bats out of turn, they are then called an improper batter. If the opposing team appeals that someone completed an AB out of order, the improper batter is immediately declared out. That makes plenty of sense, right? But it's the appeal part that makes this an absolute disaster, and it's because batting out of order must be proven through the appeal. The umpires cannot say anything, and the scorekeepers cannot say anything. It says that specifically in the rules too, that the managers are supposed to figure it out. It is entirely dependent on the opposing team paying attention to prevent the other team from just straight up cheating. I have no idea why they made it like this. I totally get why appeals exist for plays where a batter misses a base or tags up early. It keeps the opposing team and manager on their toes. But this is just insane to me. Because of that one distinction, we end up with Rule 603B5, which states, when an improper batter becomes a runner or is put out, and a pitch is made to the next batter of either team before an appeal is made, the improper batter thereby becomes the proper batter, and the results of his time at bat become legal. And because of that rule, we get stuff like this. When an improper batter becomes a proper batter because no appeal is made before the next pitch, the next batter shall be the batter whose name follows that of such legalized improper batter. The instant an improper batter's actions are legalized, the batting order picks up with the name following that of the legalized improper batter. If you had trouble following along, I don't blame you. It was the same for me, but let me try and alleviate it. I'm going to create an example of this scenario by using a current MLB team's lineup. I'll be using the Dodgers lineup from their game on August 24th of this year. The lineup goes 1 Ohtani, 2 Betts, 3 Freeman, 4 Hernandez, 5 Lux, 6 Smith, 7 Muncy, 8 Edman, and 9 Rojas. Let's just say it's the bottom of the third, and nobody's gone on base so far. If so, that means Ohtani, Betts, and Freeman were retired in inning 1, and Hernandez, Lux, and Smith were retired in inning 2. Now it is the bottom of the third, and Max Muncy, 7th in the lineup, would be the leadoff batter. But Rojas thinks he's up, and nobody questions it for whatever reason. Once Rojas is up to bat instead of Muncy, he is now an improper batter. If he manages to go through an entire at-bat, get on base, and no appeal is made, by the time the next pitch is thrown, Rojas is now a legalized improper batter. In that case, who bats next? If you said Ohtani, you would be correct. Since Rojas is now the legalized improper batter, the lineup picks up from where it normally would if he was truly the proper batter in this situation. Now, what if Tommy Edman came up to the plate? Rojas accidentally hit for Muncy, who was hitting 7th. Naturally, Edman, the 8-hole hitter, is the one who's supposed to be next. So what happens if he hits instead of Ohtani? Now we have a new improper batter. Although the original lineup called for Edman to be the 8th hitter on the Dodgers, since Rojas became a legalized improper batter, Ohtani is entitled to hit next, making Edman an improper batter now. Thereby, you can legally/illegally skip through the lineup if the opposing team doesn't notice. If it didn't make sense before, does it make sense now? My takeaway from this is all of it could have been avoided by saying, batting out of order is an automatic out if not corrected by replacing the improper batter with the proper batter in a reasonable amount of time. No. Instead, it's an appeal play, so we have all of these ridiculous scenarios. I absolutely hated trying to understand why they'd do this, but I also love how convoluted it is for no reason. After reading through this whole rule and actually seeing some recent examples of it, I actually think I like that managers have to appeal it. I've once again found my new favorite rule, and I don't know if this one can be topped. Rule 604E is one that's pretty standard over the course of an MLB season, but there's one part of it that I've never seen enforced by an umpire before. This rule states, when the occupants of a player's bench show violent disapproval of an umpire's decision, the umpire shall first give warning that such disapproval shall cease. If such action continues, the umpire shall order the offenders from the bench to the clubhouse. This is common practice. If you complain to the ump for long enough, he throws you out of the game. It doesn't matter if you're a player on the field, the manager, the bench coach, or just sitting in the dugout, if you complain about an umpire long enough, you're gone. Whether you agree with how much power the umpires have over that or not, that's just how it is, and the teams know that. However, this next part was completely out of left field. If he, referring to the umpire, is unable to detect the offender or offenders, he may clear the bench of all substitute players. The manager of the offending team shall have the privilege of recalling to the playing field only those players needed for substitution in the game. I've never seen this happen. Can you imagine an umpire not knowing who was yelling from the dugout? So he just says, alright, all your substitutions are banished to the clubhouse. They're not thrown out of the game, as it seems like they can still be used, but they have to sit in the clubhouse instead. I wish this rule was enforced because it's kind of funny. Usually when an umpire can't tell who's yelling at him, he just makes a guess, and if he's wrong, sucks to be the guy who got thrown out, I guess? You know, on second thought, maybe sending the subs to the clubhouse while still being able to use them is better than the ump just throwing out people randomly. At this point though, there's no way an umpire would actually do this. We had a situation where this could have happened earlier in the season when Aaron Boone was ejected for something a fan said and the umpire thought it was someone in the dugout. So he just ejected Boone because he couldn't identify who it was, which isn't actually the rule. Anyways, this rule can basically be removed and nothing will change. Moving on to the section about general instructions to umpires, the very first rule here is similar to one we talked about earlier. Umpires on the field should not indulge in conversation with players, keep out of the coaching box, and do not talk to the coach on duty. So this is kind of like the No Fraternization rule, and so it's completely pointless. It's not enforced at all, and for good reason. I honestly don't even get why this is in the rules, even more than the No Fraternization one. The tension between players and umps is already pretty high during games, so imagine if they had to just ignore players trying to have casual combos with them. Yeah, this one can be removed entirely as well. It won't affect the game at all. Here are two quick ones I thought were funny. Rule 903A's comment talks about official positions and how players who move from their traditional spots don't officially change that position. You know, like if an outfielder comes to the infield, he's not just a second baseman now if he's standing in that spot. He's still an outfielder. One of the examples they use here is if a second baseman goes to the outfield to form a four-man outfield, he's not suddenly an outfielder now. He's still the second baseman. However, what makes it funny is this is no longer a legal play in baseball. Due to the shift rules implemented last year, four-man outfields would be an illegal formation. I know these rule books are incredibly old and they can't account for everything. They can't just go back and change every little detail over time. But I just think it's funny their example is something that is literally illegal in today's baseball. As for the comment on Rule 907G, this one is talking about how an official score determines defensive indifference. In case you don't know, defensive indifference on stolen bases is when the runner takes off to steal and the the defense does not make any attempt to catch them, leaving them indifferent to the result of their stolen base attempt. The reason this is significant is because when defensive indifference happens, it does not count as a stolen base for the runner, leading to this rule being made. The official scorer may conclude that the defensive team is impermissibly trying to deny a runner credit for a stolen base if, for example, the defensive team fails to defend the advance of a runner approaching a league or career record or a league statistical title. I'd like to think a team would never be evil enough to actually do this to someone, but just in case they are, this rule prevents that. It would be crazy if a team had purposeful defensive indifference to screw a player out of getting a league record. Here's another scorekeeping rule I want to touch on. This is a very long comment for Rule 912A1, but we'll just discuss this one sentence at the bottom. This whole section is about informing an official scorer how they should determine what is an error and what is a hit during an MLB game. And it features this sentence saying, "The official scorer shall not charge an error to a fielder who incorrectly throws to the wrong base on a play." This is another one of those rules that you don't really see very often. I want to discuss it because at face value, this kind of situation seems like it would be an error. A player threw to the wrong base, and that decision is the very reason the batter reached first safely. But the rulebook really hones in on the fact that mental mistakes do not count as errors. The statistical error is supposed to represent physical ones, where a player fails to field a ball or inaccurately throws a ball in a situation that does not require more than ordinary effort. It sounds odd, but the stat is different than what we actually see with our eyes. In a major league game, if nobody was on base and a ground ball was hit to the shortstop and he decided to throw to second for some reason, the fans, the coaches, the umpires, and the players all know that was an error, but it's not scored as one. Despite how stupid it sounds for a player to throw to a base where they can't make an out, I think they decided to make it this way because there's a whole can of worms that opens up if you try to include mental mistakes as errors. For all those reasons, I believe that's why it is the way it is. I definitely think it's an interesting discussion to have, but I get why it was made this way, to decide that errors are strictly a physical act of failure. So once again, I haven't mentioned the page number in a while, and that's because we're finally at the home stretch. Maybe I started getting sick of this, but I feel like I haven't found nearly as many things in the second half to talk about as I did in the first. On page 145, we've now reached the section that just defines terms in the rulebook. It's mostly a reiteration of a lot of the stuff we've already been reading, but I read it anyway. For rules like this one, infield flies are mentioned quite often in the rulebook, but aren't actually defined until the very end. So here on page 151, I want to take this time to discuss misconceptions I sometimes see with this rule. So the comment for infield flies states, on the infield fly rule, the umpire is to rule whether the ball could ordinarily have been handled by an infielder, not by some arbitrary limitation such as the grass or the baselines. The umpire must rule also that a ball is an infield fly, even if handled by an outfielder, if in the umpire's judgment, the ball could have been as easily handled by an infielder. So despite the name being infield fly, there's some wiggle room here if the result doesn't quite match up. So why do I want to talk about this? Well, you'd be surprised by the number of people I see get confused when an infield fly is called on a ball that reaches the outfield. So I just wanted to clarify this rule directly from the rulebook. It's about ordinary effort, not if it lands in the infield or is caught by an infielder. And finally, the last rule we're going to talk about is kind of similar to the one I just talked about. It's a misconception I often see that I wanted to clear up a little bit. On pages 154 and 155, we get to learn about the strike zone, which is that area over home plate, the upper limit of which is a horizontal line at the midpoint between the top of the shoulders and the top of the uniform pants, and the lower level is the line at the hollow beneath the kneecap. Strike zone shall be determined from the batter's stance as the batter is prepared to swing at a pitched ball. If you've been consuming baseball media or played in some way during your life, you've certainly heard the common misconception that the top of the strike zone is the letters on the chest of the jersey. This is not really true. Sure, it could be in some situations, but it's the midpoint of one's torso, basically like the solar plexus, which leads me directly into those superimposed strike zone boxes you often see on broadcasts. Oftentimes, it looks like the strike zone is far too small or just inaccurate, especially at the top and bottom. Let's look at Cody Bellinger, for example, because he has a very tall batting stance. The box here on TV is clearly well below the midpoint of the torso, but when he gears up for a pitch, it's much more aligned. At first glance, there are many players where the strike zone looks completely off, but it's as close as you're gonna get. It's gonna vary by player, and of course, the boxes on TV can only be so accurate, but I think it works pretty well. Similar to the phrase, tie goes to the runner, which isn't actually part of the rulebook, saying that the top of the strike zone is at the letters honestly works well enough for many levels of baseball, but as it gets more professional, it doesn't really apply. Alright, that was everything I found funny or interesting after reading the entire MLB rulebook. If it wasn't for a video, I probably wouldn't have done this, but I actually did learn a few very obscure details about this sport that I dedicate a lot of my time to. Plus, I can say I read the rulebook. Again, it's not like it's some wild achievement, but at least I've done it now. One thing I wanted to do while reading this was to try to pretend like I know nothing about baseball in the back of my head. This wasn't one of the main topics for the video, but it was just a side thing that I wanted to see if the rulebook was actually good at teaching people the sport, which I know sounds dumb because that's kind of its purpose, but you never know. And it's not too bad for that. Everything is very much simplified. However, if someone wants to get into baseball, I still think the best way is to just watch it with someone else and ask questions. Learn as things progress and more obscure plays and events happen within the game. Just reading rules on a page doesn't really give you the visual aspect. Anyway, for next video, I'll be going over all 23,362 baseball reference player pages. So look forward to that. Thanks for watching.